boy, you're going to want to hear this.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Reformed High Churchman. I hope you're having an absolutely wonderful day. And I have a question that I wanted to ask everyone. When you go to church and they're serving communion, what are your thoughts about communion? Now, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of the theological debates over what is real presence, whether we have memorial, whether we have the sacramental presence, whether there's the mystical or the transubstantiatory, or any of those detailed arguments, maybe at a later date, but not today. What I want to ask is, and this would essentially be for my Anglican or traditional liturgical listeners, since they are the vast majority of people that follow me. When you see communion being offered to children, and I mean children less than 8 years old, what are your thoughts? Now, I can tell you from the standpoint of an Anglican priest that when I see my brethren in the Anglican Church serving communion, celebrating the Eucharist with infants, that really grieves my heart. That creates an issue in my soul that looks at my fellow clergymen, and my wife gets on me for losing my decorum, if you will. When I see my fellow clergymen doing this particular act with children, I wonder if they take seriously the Apostle Paul's injunction in 1 Corinthians. Now, I want to look at this issue from three different perspectives. I want to look at it from the biblical, theological, and then the historical perspectives. Because I think if we take seriously what's happening in communion, in the Eucharist, and we see that children are being included in this, we should ask questions, because there are arguments that are presented in favor of this practice, which is generally called Paedo-Communion, communing children, that don't really stand up to scrutiny. Well, let's start with the most obvious place, just so that we can get this launched. I want to look at the biblical arguments that are used, at least from my perspective, in challenging this practice of Paedo-Communion. And the most obvious place is to start with St. Paul's warning in 1 Corinthians 11. It's actually between 26 and 30, but I'll look at verse 28 where he says, "Examine yourself." Now, when one comes to communion, Paul specifically requires that the individual receiving the communion must examine themselves before eating and drinking. Infants cannot engage in this type of moral or spiritual assessment. They simply cannot. So, to present communion to a child, especially given the warning that St. Paul provides us in those verses between verses 26 to 30, makes me wonder why one would put a child's soul in danger. Part of this process is the discernment is the discernment of the body and the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, we're not talking about a physical I'll use the term transubstantiatory understanding, one that Rome would invoke at this point. The bread and the wine remain bread and the wine, and at a later date we can talk about what it means to discern how Jesus is truly present in the bread and the wine. But for the sake of discussion today, the point is that the individual must be able to discern what is taking place in communion. This requires a cognitive, it requires an intellectual and a spiritual understanding beyond what infants are capable of providing. And then there's what I consider truly a serious concern, and that is, as those of us that are involved in the Anglican tradition specifically, but others as well, I know conservative Presbyterians do this as well. Confession takes place prior to the reception of the bread and the wine. Now, for the life of me, I don't know anyone that believes that someone else can confess another person's sins. We can identify another person's sins, but I can't confess my brother Billy's sins. He has to confess those himself. And before one participates in communion in our services, confession is required, confession to God, before one can receive the bread and the wine. There isn't a child that I know that's capable of cognitively understanding what they're doing, at least not prior to the age of, let's say, 5. But we have people that are giving communion to young people younger than 5. This is a serious matter. And then when we come to communion, we understand that the Lord's Supper is an act of remembering and proclaiming the death of Christ. Paul states this in 1 Corinthians 11:26. Infants cannot intentionally proclaim anything other than their own selfish needs and wants, because that's just a biological reaction based on their age. And then biblically, we have to truly be concerned, and I wonder how many people take this seriously, the warning that Paul provides in 1 Corinthians 11:26-30. This is a very serious instruction from the Apostle Paul about improperly participating in communion, because it brings judgment. And when you read the text, what he's talking about is people dying because they improperly received communion. Allowing infants to partake without the discernment that is required to participate in this act puts their souls at risk. I have to admit, I don't get it. Why would you even take the chance of doing this? Well, there's another argument against giving children this particular sacrament, and that is we come to the theological distinctions. Now, what you constantly hear, and I hear this all the time, is the attempted reconciliation or the attempted connection to baptism. Now, for those of us that believe in the proper covenant relationship between the Old and the New Testament, and we see the connection between circumcision and baptism that is applied to infants, The argument then goes, well, since the faith of the parents can act as justification for the inclusion of the child in the covenant, and therefore that's why children can be baptized, much as children were circumcised in the Old Testament because of the faith of their parents. The same applies for communion. The fact that it is the faith of the parents that is covering, if you will, the infant when they receive communion. Well, unfortunately, the problem is baptism and communion are two entirely different sacraments. Baptism is a rite of initiation. Baptism is the inclusion into the covenant. Baptism is the first step. Baptism gets you into the covenant relationship with Christ, with the church. But it is only to be done one time, which raises all sorts of questions and concerns about people that constantly get rebaptized when they move from one jurisdiction to another. But again, that's a conversation for another time. Baptism is a sign that's given once, and let me use a fairly stark illustration. If circumcision and baptism are covenantally connected, and we see baptism as the fulfillment of circumcision, can you imagine somebody going from, let's say they're going from the tribe of Judah to the tribe of Zebulun, just as an example. And they say, well, I've been circumcised as a member of the tribe of Judah, but since I have to go to the tribe of Zebulun, I'm going to be recircumcised. Really? Really? Is that how that works? Now, obviously, a Jew moving from one tribe to another wouldn't need to do that. But you see my point. My point is an act of initiation, a rite of initiation, a right to include one into a covenant relationship cannot be repeated. Otherwise, you've got a really difficult problem with adults constantly being circumcised. And I'll just leave that visual to your imagination. So baptism is a rite of initiation. Baptism is a rite that includes you into something. And once it's done, it's done. I mean, we have means to remind ourselves of our baptism, but we don't repeat the act. The Lord's Supper, on the other hand, has a very robust and comprehensive application in our lives. Number one, it's the rite of continuation. We maintain our relationship. We verify the fact that we are in the church. We verify the fact that we continue to have this covenantal binding commitment to Christ by receiving the bread and the wine, receiving his grace, receiving him in this sacrament. This is a repeated action. It is to be administered continually, frequently. And it involves all of those other things that we just mentioned, the self-examination, the understanding of confessing our sins before we approach God, the confession that allows us with good conscience to receive the body and blood of Christ. This confirms our constant commitment to the triune Godhead. And in order to receive this, in order to receive communion, we continually have to examine ourselves to make sure that we are worthy to receive this ongoing nourishment, this ongoing grace, requiring our active faith as well as our said examination. The idea of receiving communion is to confirm what we, as the individual receiving communion, believe, not what somebody else believes. We are the ones that have to confirm our beliefs. And this is one of the concerns that we have, because the requirement is active faith. The Lord's Supper is for those who can consciously feed on Christ in their hearts by faith. That is out of the possibility. For infants, they cannot exercise that type of faith in this sacramental act. The idea of what is taking place in communion, when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," participating in the Lord's Supper involves remembering, proclaiming, discerning, examining, and participating in the anamnesis. That's what the Greek word means, remember. And I'm going to get to the importance of that in just 1 second when I talk about the historical arguments. But keep that word, anamnesis, in mind. Being involved in the Lord's Supper requires us to remember and participate and examine how we involve ourselves in the full redemptive work of Christ, from the redemptive acts of God in the garden to the ascension, acts that presuppose maturity. This is one of the reasons Calvin repeatedly argued that communion is solid food for those past infancy. It is a different covenantal expression. It's not the same as baptism. And then there's the historical arguments. First, unless you come to this with some preconceptions, there's no compelling evidence that the early church practiced Paedo-Communion. None. Even Origen, who was late 3rd century, early 4th century, explicitly states that children were not given communion. And for those of my friends who constantly refer to the practice of the Eastern Orthodox, our Orthodox brethren perform chrism, which is they baptize and then confirm the child immediately. Well, according to the Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev, who wrote a massive 5-volume work, you can get it through St. Vladimir's Press, on orthodoxy, theological, historical, practical, etc. On page 42 of the first volume, he says, of the 5th volume, not of the first volume, page 42 of the 5th volume, he writes that by the 4th century, I want you to listen to this, by the 4th century, it was customary to withhold baptism until the communicant was 30 years old. Now, it's important to understand the situation that was occurring within the church during the first 4 centuries. And I've been teaching on the 7 ecumenical councils, so if you're interested, you can go and you can hear how this develops. But I'm just going to give you a couple of sentences to create the image in your mind so that you understand why this particular Orthodox clergyman says this. We know for a fact that at the earliest points in church history, whether you're talking about Paul's household baptisms, or the connection between circumcision and baptism, we know for a fact that archaeology has proved that within the first at least 100 years, by the early 2nd century, We're talking 120, 130. We have grave sites of children 8, 10, 11 days old with the dates on the headstones that also indicate the date of their baptism. So we know that baptism of children occurred very early on. And then an odd thing happened. The church started to undergo massive persecution, and once this persecution began, people started falling away. We see this come to the head with the Donatist controversy in the 400s with Augustine and his battles against those individuals. However, the point being, people were being baptized as infants and then falling away. And what wound up happening was the church looked at this situation and said, okay, well, we're experiencing all sorts of controversy because we have all of these people that have been baptized and now they're apostatizing. Do we let them back in? Do we not let them back in? Dealing with the Donatist controversy. So what winds up happening is infant baptisms are put on hold. Not because they didn't believe in infant baptism, but because they wanted to make sure that those that were baptized remained in the faith after persecution. Now, we can quibble over the theological understanding of baptism, and that's, again, another conversation for another time. But the point was they took baptism so seriously that for the first 4 centuries, until the 300s, the late 300s, you had to go through a minimum of a year's catechetical training before you could be baptized. And then they would wait, especially in the Eastern Church, they would wait until you were in your 30s before you could be baptized. And if I remember right, the Hilarion said that the date was like 397. We're almost directly into the 5th century now. So, again, the point isn't that Paedo-Communion was erroneous. The point is that there's no foundation for the assertion that the Eastern Church, very early on, practiced Paedo-Communion. That's simply not true. It is, in the Eastern Church, a middle to late 4th century invention. And you can read Eastern scholars. I just cited one. I could have cited Meyendorff. I could have cited Losky. I could have cited Bulgakov. Can't pronounce his name. Sorry, Bulgakov. I could have cited these men and their writings. But I just wanted to give you one example of why the historical argument in that case fails. And another argument historically is that, unlike in the West, where confirmation is restricted to the bishop, in the East, a priest can confirm. And this practice has been a point of issue between the two churches for a while. So the practice then being used in the West to have a priest serve communion because a child has been confirmed violates a long-established liturgical practice. Bishops should not be confirming infants. And then there's one final issue that demonstrates the breakdown between the ancient period and what's currently being practiced, and that is the invocation of Passover. Well, number one, Old Testament Passover required only males to attend, and they had to do this annually. Number two, the Jewish boys did not participate until the age of 13. They called it the age of consent, but it still was the age of 13. And here's the key. When the child was getting ready to move forward for their bar mitzvah, which is essentially the equivalent of our confirmation. At the point in the Passover meal, there's one particular moment where the child would get up and say, "Why do we do these things this night?" And then what happens is the host begins this recitation, this remembrance, this anamnesis of all of the redemptive acts of God in history for Israel. And this is more than just verbal and cognitive. This is participatory. They actually participate in the recollection. They use noisemakers. They shout. They light candles. It is a participation to the best of their ability in the full redemptive acts of God. A child cannot and does not participate. They may be present, but they're not participating in this. Infants cannot consume the full Passover meal. And these facts alone undermine the argument that covenant children must participate in the Lord's Supper because they allegedly participated in the Passover. That is not correct. All of the Reformed confessions, Heidelberg, Belgic, Westminster, uniformly reject this and require profession of faith and examination. And the texts that usually are cited, like 1 Corinthians 10, 3 and 4, is not referring to Passover. It's referring to Exodus 16, 15 and 35, where the manna was being provided, and Exodus 17:6, which is water from the rock. These are two entirely different acts at two entirely different periods of time, identifying two entirely different functions. Well, anyway, I want you to keep that in mind. Be sober when we start talking about what our children are doing. And if you're a minister, my heavens, please be aware you may be putting the child's soul at risk by giving them communion before they're confirmed. Now, periodically I'm going to mention other podcasters because I want our community to be the podcast community. I want it to be well represented, and I have to recommend this young man. His title is the Anglican Acolyte, and he is the leader of an Anglican Renaissance movement. And I have to tell you, you're going to love this young man. And when you're as old as I am, basically everybody's a young man. But he is intelligent. He is passionate. He has a heart for God. And as my friends in Boston would say, he's wicked funny. So look up the Anglican Acolyte and look up the Anglican Renaissance movement. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. All right, my friends. Until next time, engage constantly. Think critically. Always season your speech lovingly with a bit of salt, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. May you grow in the knowledge and grace of our sovereign Lord, Jesus Christ.